Today at Speedy's Garage, we loosen a bolt, make a great big mess, and send something off in the mail. Today at Speedy's Garage, we're doing a little easy maintenance on Project SportRunner here. And this is an easy way to get into working on cars if it's something new to you. We're going to do an oil change, and I'm going to talk about the oil analysis I'm going to have performed on the vehicle after we've had meth injection on it for a year. I'm curious how that's impacted the oil. I've got some oil analysis from before the meth injection went on, but after the supercharger, and I've got some oil analysis before the supercharger. So I'll be able to look over the years how those changes have impacted oil life and the way the engine's actually performing. And this is something that's so easy to do. I didn't even feel like pulling Go Man Go out of the shop, so I'm just gonna do it in my standard 2-car garage. Obviously we're gonna need some oil. I personally like this Pennzoil Platinum Full Synthetic. I'm using 5W30 in this particular vehicle, but make sure you check yours and get the proper weight. Also gonna need an oil filter. Again, I'm using the Purelator 1 oil filter. I've done a lot of testing through the years, oil analysis, etc. And for the price, that's a pretty good filter. It's comparable to a Mobil 1, but I'll use Mobil 1 in a pinch if I can't find the Purelator. I've got a new O-ring or gasket for the oil drain plug on this vehicle. A lot of new ones, you don't have to use this anymore, but on this old 4Runner we do. I got my trusty ratchet, an extension. I'm gonna need a couple of sockets. One's for the drain plug, one's for the splash pans. You will need some kind of socket for your oil filter. This is the kind I like to use in its specific size for the one I'm working on. And then I've got a torque wrench for the oil drain plug when I'm done. And I don't want to get messy, so I'm going to use some gloves. I also have this big 16-quart container to drain my oil into. I like it because it's big enough to keep me from making a mess. And I'm going to need a funnel to put the fresh oil in, as well as a light so I can see. And finally, I'm using a creeper because I'm too old to be crawling around on cold concrete. And I always get the engine up to operating temp before draining the oil. This truck had actually sat for a couple of days, so I just drove it around the block to heat it up. And I personally like to start by removing the oil fill cap. And I don't completely remove it, I just set it to the side, kind of like that, so it gets air. And that's to prevent the oil from going glug, glug, glug and making a big mess when I go to drain it from the drain plug. And on this particular vehicle, we have to remove 4 12mm bolts to get the shield off the oil pan. And now that I went back and got the right size socket, which is 14mm for this vehicle, I'm going to break loose the oil drain bolt. And remember, it's lefty-loosey, not righty-tighty. Now for the fun part, I've got the oil drain pan in place, and now it's time to play Russian roulette with the drain plug and hope I got the pan in the right spot so we don't make a big mess. Make sure you remember to take the cap off the drain pan so the oil can actually drain into it. Done that before, forgotten. There we go. And now just let that drain until you just get a couple of drips a second and it's good to go. And after let it drain for a sec, I'm gonna go ahead and grab our sample for our oil analysis. And I always try to at least put a little bit of oil in the oil filter. This particular vehicle, it mounts horizontally, so I can't fill it up like I would on a vehicle where it mounted vertically. But I'm going to at least put enough in there that the threads, or I'm sorry, the filter media can absorb some of that oil. And the reason for that is just to make sure the engine has good fresh oil at first startup after the oil change. And then I'm just going to put a little bit of fresh oil on the rubber gasket, and that prevents it from sticking to the block for future oil changes. So we're only getting a drip of oil from the pan every few seconds, so it's fully drained. Now we're going to reinstall the drain plug and torque it down to proper spec. And if your vehicle has one, don't forget to put your new washer on your drain plug. Wipe off the oil pan around the drain plug to make sure it's good and clean, and then always start your drain plug by hand. And next, just tighten the drain plug to the proper torque spec. On this truck, it's 29 foot-pounds. And it's a 3.4 liter Toyota V6. And now it's time for a little more drain pan Russian roulette. On some vehicles, draining the oil filter is actually pretty easy. They have it in a nice easy spot to get to, and it's vertical, so you can just unthread it, flip it upside down in your drain pan, and you're good to go, no muss, no fuss. On this particular vehicle, the engineers saw fit to mount the oil filter horizontally on the side of the block. So that means I have to get at it from the top, hope I have the drain pan in the right place to catch all the oil that comes out of the oil filter when we loosen it. And while that oil filter drains, I'll tell you about a couple other ways to do it. Some people prefer to pop this little splash shield off the side of the fender, and then you can reach through and get to the oil filter that way. Or you can also remove the front splash shield there, that metal piece, and you can fish it out the bottom, but it's a little bit more tricky, and I found it more messy. And I never was wild about going through the fender, because I see over time that splash shield or that splash rubber skirt starting to tear up, and I saw a lot of broken clips in my future, so I never went that route. I've actually never done it that way on this vehicle. So once the oil filter has drained for 5 or 10 minutes, I get a rag ready, and I just fish it out from the top as fast as I can in case there's oil still in it. Being careful not to drop it, obviously. And then back underneath, I just lay the oil filter upside down on the drain pan and let it finish draining out while I do the rest of the work. And now I'm going to reinstall our fresh oil filter. Remember to put a little bit of oil on the rubber seal as I mentioned. I can't show you this because you can't see anything anyway, but I'm going to tighten it down hand tight, and then I'm going to put the wrench on it and tighten it 1/4 turn. That's all it takes. And I'll install it from the top just like I took the old one out. And you'll also want to take a look at your old oil filter to make sure the gasket is still there and it hasn't remained stuck to the block. And before you install your new filter, you want to run your finger along the connection point at the block to make sure there's not a gasket on there. If you get double gaskets like that, it'll leak. So now I'm going to spend 5 minutes or so wiping everything down where I got a little bit of oil leakage from the oil filter. If you own one of these trucks and you have a better way of doing this, please tell me how you do it that doesn't make such a mess. I've had these for years. I've tried funnels, I've tried little plastic shields, I've tried everything, and this is about the only way I've found to do it, but it always tends to make a little bit of a mess. And next, put your funnel in place and fill up the engine with your favorite oil. I know, let's start an internet debate about what the best oil is. That's always fun. And this 2002 4Runner takes 5.5 quarts if you change the filter with the oil, which I recommend you do. I always put 5 in and then check it, so that's what I'm going to do here. And I got our 5 quarts in. I'm going to check. I'm going to pull the dipstick out, wipe it off, and then it's straight in and back out again. So as you can see, it's right there towards the top of the marks. It's in between, which is satisfactory. But since I have the oil, I'm going to go ahead and put the extra 1/2 quart in, which should make it right there at that top mark. With the extra 1/2 quart added, we're going to check it again. Same process, always wipe it off. See where we're at. Yeah, that's perfect. So as you can see, it comes in perfect with 5.5 quarts. Putting too much oil in is just as bad or almost as bad as not having enough, so always double check. Next, pop the fill cap back on and fire up the vehicle for a quick test, and what we're checking for is that the low oil light goes out quickly.
Testing. System ready. Voice alert.
And it did, so now we're just going to take a peek for leaks. No leaks around the drain plug, and I don't see any underneath the oil filter, and I didn't see any at the oil filter, so we're good to go. And next, reinstall any splash shields or dust shields. Always start the bolts by hand, and I find doing the rear ones first to hold it in place make it easier. And on this truck, don't tighten any of them until you have all 4 of them started. And once you got them all going, go ahead and tighten them down. And most oil jugs are graduated, so it makes it pretty hard to mess up when you're putting the oil in. Left side on this one is liters, the right side is quarts. And as you can see, I stopped on 1.5. I had some from another jug that I used, so that's how I got the 5.5 quarts. And after you've fired up the vehicle, do one last check of the oil on the dipstick to make sure the right amount is in there. Sometimes the oil filter will absorb a little bit of it, and ours is still right on the money, so we're done. Now just clean everything up. And be sure to take your oil to your favorite parts store. They'll let you dump it in the back in their recycle bin for free. And finally, don't forget to write that you changed your oil in your maintenance log. So now we've got our oil sample ready to send in. going to take the contents of the container out, get an absorption mat just in case there's any leakage, get a plastic bag to put the actual sample bottle in, further prevent leakage. You get a decal for your windshield so you know when to change your oil next. And the important part is you get this form that's in the back, or in the container rather. You get engine, make, and model. You got a unit ID. So if you're going to do samples in any kind of frequency, which I typically do them once a year or so, I'm going to call it 4Runner so that when they get future samples, they'll know exactly what it's for. You put sample date, miles on the oil, miles on the engine. If you added any oil in between, the oil type that was used, you got a section for remarks. On the back, you got some payment options and info. I just call them and give them my information. I have them keep it on file. You can also do it online if you like. And then vehicle make and model, the year, was the oil changed when the sample was taken, are you interested in extended oil use, blah, blah, blah. The big thing on the back is, would you like a TBN? And that stands for total base number. It's an extra $10. I always check yes, because that's really the measurement that'll tell you if the oil still had life in it or not. So I always check yes to that and just pay the extra 10 bucks. Now we're going to bag this up, get it boxed and ready to ship. You can actually send it in the container itself. You'll get a report back giving some good data on how the engine and the oil are actually doing. They give averages of your vehicle's reports if you've sent in any previous samples, as well as universal averages from their database for other vehicles that they sampled for your specific make and model. A few years ago, I went to 1 year oil changes on this 4Runner. I tested it 6 months. The oil still looked great. So then I went to 1 year. And as you can see, the oil still had life left in it by that TBN number at the bottom there being 2.3. That's the test I mentioned earlier. It cost 10 extra bucks, but it's well worth it to know how the oil is doing in your specific application. Aluminum, copper, lead, and iron are elevated slightly compared to previous samples, but this sample had about double the miles on it, so that would be expected. Water meth showed no impact in this sample or the analysis, so we know that we can stick to our 1 year oil change even with the water meth injection. So as you saw from the analysis, a 1 year oil change is no problem, and you don't have to buy some boutique oil or some special extended maintenance oil or whatever. A standard good synthetic oil will work. This video isn't about telling you what oil to buy, but what I will say is a few years ago, I did some testing. I was in a position where at work I had to drive quite a bit. So I bought an inexpensive, fuel efficient vehicle just to drive back and forth. And I put about 100,000 miles on that vehicle in about 18 months. So I was driving a lot. And what it did is it allowed me to test different oil brands and oil filters. And what I would do is I would run one of the brands for 10,000 miles, do an oil change, test it, do a sample. Then I would put a different brand in, run that for 10,000 miles, drain the oil, refresh it, and then run that for 10,000 miles, and then test that sample. That way there was no leftover residual oil from the original or the previous test. What I did find was that the Pennzoil Platinum oil actually performed extremely well. It was right there with Mobil 1. I tested a couple of others I won't mention that didn't do as good. They probably were fine for a less interval on the oil, but I wanted to go for 1 year or 10 or 11,000 miles. Sometimes I even skipped actually changing the oil filter just to see if that would have any impact, and quite frankly it didn't. Even Blackstone came back and said, hey, you didn't need to change your oil filter. And I would note it on the paperwork I sent in. They would say run it for another 10,000 miles, we'll check it again just to make sure the media itself wasn't breaking down. So I think a 1 year oil change is fine. Now that's obvious on an older car like the 4Runner that doesn't have one of those oil reminder systems in it. Those systems, some of them are very sophisticated. Most of them are not. Most of them are just time-based and how long the car spent when it was cold, how long it took to warm up, how much throttle you're giving it. If you're doing a lot of wide open throttle runs, obviously that probably impacts the timer on that. Some of them are more sophisticated and they have sensors actually in the engine that read contaminants in the oil, and that has an impact on how soon it tells you to change your oil. For an older car like the 4Runner, I'm just going to stick with the 1 year. For the newer car, I will follow whatever the computer system tells me because that's probably best. Hopefully you found this information helpful. We see now that you don't have to change your oil every 3,000 miles. That's a myth. Probably 50 years ago that was the case when engines weren't as good and oils weren't as good, but anymore, do analysis on your car, find out what it likes. I'm going to do 1 year on mine. If you'd like to see some more information, be sure to visit my website, speedysgarage.net, and don't forget to hit subscribe in the bottom right corner. We'll see you out there.